The first stone, a jagged piece of shale no bigger than a fist, was a surprise. It pinged off the carbon fiber side panel of the Ferrari SF90 Stradale with a sound like a champagne cork popping in a cathedral, sharp and obscene against the storm's roar. Adrian Sterling flinched, his knuckles white on the leather-wrapped wheel. The second, larger and heavier, struck the passenger window with a percussive crack that sent a spiderweb of fractures across the reinforced glass. He swore, a raw, guttural sound swallowed by the wind. Through the blur of the frantic windshield wipers, he saw them, a ragged line of figures emerging from the curtain of rain on the collapsing embankment above. They weren't locals caught in the deluge. Their faces were obscured by dark hoods, their movements too deliberate. One of them raised an arm, and for a heart-stopping second, Adrian thought it was a weapon. It was just another rock, but it was the intent that froze the blood in his veins. "This can't be happening," he breathed, jamming the accelerator. The hybrid V8 engine screamed, a shriek of technological fury, but the wheels only spun, digging the million-dollar hypercar deeper into the churning, chocolate-brown mud of the washed-out country road. The car lurched, its tail fishtailing violently before sinking with a final, sickening groan. He was trapped. The figures were closer now, descending the muddy slope, their shapes solidifying into a threat more real and terrifying than the rising water that was already beginning to seep over the door sills. Then a new sound cut through the chaos. Not the wind, not the rain, not the rocks, but a high, clear voice singing a nursery rhyme off-key. A tiny figure in a bright yellow raincoat appeared from the opposite direction, trudging through the mud, dragging something small and red behind her on a string. The men on the hill stopped, their menacing advance paused by this impossible apparition. Adrian stared, his panic momentarily eclipsed by sheer, unadulterated disbelief. The little girl, no older than 5, didn't even seem to notice the hooded men or the raging storm. Her focus was entirely on the beautiful, broken red car, stuck in the mud. She stopped a few feet away, her brow furrowed in concentration. She looked at the half-submerged Ferrari, then down at the object she was pulling, a plastic toy tractor. With the solemn gravity of a surgeon about to perform a life-saving operation, she turned to Adrian, her small voice somehow carrying over the gale. "Don't worry, mister," she declared, pointing a chubby, mittened finger at his sinking masterpiece. "I can help you. My tractor is very strong." The world seemed to hold its breath. The rain, the wind, the figures on the hill, it all faded into a muted backdrop for this single, surreal moment. Adrian Sterling, a man who could buy and sell entire countries, whose name was whispered with awe and fear in boardrooms across the globe, sat trapped in a technological marvel, his life hanging by a thread, and his only offer of salvation was a little girl with a toy. The absurdity was so profound, so utterly complete, that a wild, hysterical laugh bubbled up in his chest. He was either about to die, or he was already dead, and this was some bizarre, childish purgatory. The laugh died in his throat as one of the figures on the hill finally moved, taking a decisive step forward, his intentions as dark and muddy as the water pooling around Adrian's feet. The little girl, however, was undeterred. She was already busy, trying to tie the string from her little red tractor to the Ferrari's sleek, aerodynamic front splitter, humming the same nursery rhyme under her breath, a beacon of impossible innocence in a world gone mad. The sound that broke the spell wasn't a rock, but a man's shout. It was a different voice, deep and resonant with authority, cutting through the storm from the same direction the girl had appeared. "Lily, get back here! Now!" A large figure emerged from the woods, a man built like an oak tree, wearing a drenched flannel jacket and a face etched with worry. He carried a heavy-duty flashlight, its beam slicing through the rain, and in his other hand was something that was most definitely not a rock. A hunting rifle, held at a low, ready position, but unmistakably present. The hooded men on the embankment froze completely. They exchanged a look, a quick, silent communication of risk versus reward. Whatever their plan had been, a lone, trapped man in a fancy car was one thing. A local with a rifle and a child to protect was another calculation entirely. For a few tense seconds, the standoff held. The father, Tom, kept his eyes locked on the figures, his body a shield between them and his daughter. Lily, however, seemed oblivious, still fumbling with her string. "But, Daddy, the man is stuck," she protested, her voice a comical whine of frustration. The sight was so incongruous, the imminent threat, the father's grim face, and the little girl's single-minded focus on her rescue mission, that it shattered the tension into a million pieces. One of the figures on the hill let out a short, sharp laugh of disbelief. Another shook his head and began to back away. Their moment, whatever it had been, was lost. Without another word, they turned and melted back into the rain-soaked landscape, their retreat as sudden as their appearance. Tom kept the rifle trained on the spot where they had vanished for a full minute before finally lowering it, the coiled tension leaving his shoulders in a long, shaky breath. He rushed forward, scooping Lily into his arms. "Don't you ever do that again. You hear me?" he said, his voice a mixture of terror and relief. "What were you thinking?" "His car is stuck," Lily repeated, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world, pointing her mitten at Adrian. Tom's gaze followed hers, and for the first time he seemed to properly take in the scene. The impossibly low, impossibly red car, half swallowed by the mud, its engine silent, its hazard lights blinking in a frantic, rhythmic pulse. And inside, the man. Adrian watched them through the fractured glass, a ghost in his own machine. The immediate threat was gone, but his situation was no less dire. The water was now ankle-deep on the floor mats, cold and greasy. The car's complex electronics were likely already compromised. He was stranded in the middle of a biblical storm, in a place that clearly wasn't on any map his GPS recognized, with a dead phone and a car that was more boat anchor than automobile. He rested his head back against the leather seat, the adrenaline draining away, leaving behind a bone-deep weariness that had nothing to do with the last 10 minutes and everything to do with the last 3 years. Tom approached the window cautiously, his daughter still tucked under one arm. He peered inside, his expression unreadable. "You all right in there?" he called out, his voice slightly muffled by the glass and the rain. Adrian couldn't bring himself to answer. He just nodded, a slow, tired movement. What was there to say? "Yes, I'm fine, other than the fact my car is a write-off. I was nearly robbed or worse by a gang of thugs. And I'm currently marooned in a hurricane?" The door wouldn't open. The water pressure and the mud had sealed it shut. He tried the electronic release, but the dashboard was dark, the battery finally having surrendered to the deluge. A new, more primal wave of panic, claustrophobia, began to creep in. He was sealed in his own multi-million-dollar tomb. He banged a fist against the window, the sound dull and pathetic. "It's stuck! I can't get out!" Tom's eyes widened. He shifted Lily to his other hip and tried the handle from the outside, pulling with his full weight. The door didn't budge. He grunted with effort, his boots sinking deeper into the mud. "The water's got it sealed," he said, more to himself than to Adrian. "Hold on." He disappeared from view for a moment. Adrian heard a clattering sound from the back of an old, battered pickup truck. He now noticed was parked just off the road, a vehicle so antithetical to his own, it was almost comical. Tom returned with a crowbar. "Gonna have to break the rest of the glass," he yelled. "Cover your face!" Adrian shielded his eyes with his arms as Tom swung the crowbar. The already fractured glass imploded with a loud, crystalline pop, showering the interior with sparkling tempered shards. The storm immediately invaded the quiet cockpit, a blast of wind and rain that felt like a physical assault. Tom reached inside, his hand surprisingly gentle as he brushed the remaining fragments from the window frame. "All right, come on out. Easy now." Awkwardly, Adrian clambered out of the car, his expensive suit trousers instantly soaked, his Italian leather shoes sinking into the grasping mud. He stood there, shivering, a ludicrous figure in a bespoke suit covered in glass dust, standing in a muddy field next to his drowned supercar, while the sky fell down around him. He looked at the car, then at the man and his daughter, and finally at the toy tractor, its red plastic a defiant splash of color against the grim, gray-brown landscape. Its string was still looped uselessly around the car's front winglet. The little girl, Lily, looked up at him from the safety of her father's arms, her eyes wide with concern. "Did it work?" she asked, her voice filled with genuine hope. Adrian stared at her, at the raw, unvarnished innocence in her face. The question was so pure, so completely devoid of the cynicism and calculation that defined his entire world, that it struck him with the force of a physical blow. A dam inside him, one he had spent years building, wall by wall, deal by deal, loss by loss, finally broke. He wasn't sure if it was a laugh or a sob that escaped his lips, but it was a sound of pure, helpless surrender. "Yes," he heard himself say, his voice cracking. "Yes, I think it did." The farmhouse was less a structure and more a testament to stubborn endurance. It was a classic two-story clapboard, its white paint weathered to a soft, mottled gray, peeling in patches like sunburnt skin. The porch sagged slightly to one side, and the roof had a patchwork of new and old shingles. But the windows glowed with a warm, yellow light that seemed to push back against the storm's oppressive gloom. It was the most welcoming sight Adrian had seen in years. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of wet wool, wood smoke, and something delicious, cinnamon and baked apples. A woman, whom Adrian presumed was Tom's wife and Lily's mother, met them at the door. Her name was Sarah. She had kind, tired eyes, and a few strands of brown hair had escaped her messy bun to stick to her forehead. She took one look at Adrian's shivering, mud-caked form, and her face softened with a sympathy that he hadn't encountered from a stranger in a very long time. "Good heavens, Tom, what have you dragged in?" she asked, her tone gentle. "Get him inside before he catches his death." They ushered him in, their concern a tangible thing, wrapping around him like a warm blanket. Lily squirmed out of her father's arms and ran to her mother, babbling about the red car and her tractor. Tom just shook his head, a wry smile touching his lips. "Found him stuck down by the old bridge. The whole road's washed out." Sarah clucked her tongue. "That old bridge has been threatening to give up the ghost for years. County's never had the money to fix it proper." She turned her attention back to Adrian. "We need to get you out of those wet things. Tom, find him some of your clothes. They'll be a bit big on him, I reckon, but they'll be dry." Adrian found himself unable to protest, a passenger in his own rescue. He was used to being the one giving orders, to having his needs anticipated by a fleet of assistants and staff. This raw, unpretentious hospitality was disorienting. In his world, help always came with an invoice. Tom led him up a creaking staircase to a small, simple bathroom. He handed Adrian a threadbare towel and a set of clothes, worn jeans, a thick flannel shirt, and wool socks. "The shower's a bit temperamental," Tom said, rubbing the back of his neck. "You gotta jiggle the handle a bit to get the hot water going. And don't mind the pressure. It's got a mind of its own." Adrian stood in the small bathroom, the door closed, and looked at his reflection in the steamed-up mirror. The man looking back was a stranger. His usually immaculate hair was plastered to his head. His face was pale with exhaustion, and his eyes held a hollowed-out look he hadn't seen since the days and weeks after the funeral. He stripped off the sodden, ruined suit, a garment that had cost more than the battered pickup truck that had, in essence, saved his life, and let it fall into a pathetic heap on the floor. The hot water, when it came, was a miracle. It sluiced the mud and the cold from his skin, and for a few minutes he just stood there under the weak stream, letting the heat seep into his bones. He washed away the grime of the road, but he couldn't wash away the feeling of displacement, of having slipped through a crack in his own meticulously constructed reality. When he emerged, dressed in Tom's clothes, the transformation was complete. The fabric was soft from countless washings, smelling faintly of sawdust and fresh air. The jeans were loose, held up only by his belt, and the shirt hung on his frame, but he felt more substantial, more real, than he had in his own expensive armor. Downstairs, Sarah had set a place for him at a large, scarred wooden table in the kitchen. A bowl of thick, steaming stew was waiting for him, along with a chunk of homemade bread. Lily was sitting opposite, watching him with wide, curious eyes, her chin propped in her hands. "Daddy's clothes are too big for you," she observed, with the brutal honesty of a child. Adrian managed a small smile. "Yes, they are." He sat down, the chair scraping against the worn linoleum floor. He picked up the spoon. The stew was rich with beef and vegetables, and the bread was dense and chewy. It was simple, unadorned food, and it was the best thing he had ever tasted. He ate ravenously, suddenly aware of a hunger he hadn't felt all day. Tom and Sarah sat with him, nursing mugs of coffee, their quiet presence a comfort rather than an intrusion. They didn't pepper him with questions. They didn't ask who he was or what a car like that was doing on a road like this. They just let him be, a courtesy more valuable than any five-star hotel service. "The storm's not letting up," Tom said, looking out the window into the black, churning night. "The radio says the main highway's flooded out too. You're not going anywhere tonight, I'm afraid. You're welcome to the spare room." I don't know what to say," Adrian stammered, putting down his spoon. "Thank you for everything. The car, I'll arrange to have it towed as soon as the roads are clear, and I'll compensate you for the trouble, of course." The moment the words left his mouth, he knew they were wrong. The air in the room shifted. Tom's easygoing expression tightened, and he put his coffee mug down with a definitive click. "We didn't pull you out of that mud for compensation, mister," he said, his voice low and even, but with an edge of steel. "We did it because it was the right thing to do. That's how it works out here." Adrian felt a flush of shame. He had defaulted to his native language, money. He had taken their genuine kindness and tried to turn it into a transaction, reducing their humanity to a line item on his expense report. "I'm sorry," he said, and he meant it. "That was inappropriate. I'm not used to—" He trailed off, unsure how to explain his world to people like this. A world where everything had a price, where kindness was a currency, and trust was a commodity to be hedged. Sarah saved him, her voice gentle but firm. "We know. It's all right. You're not the first person from the city to get lost on these roads." She smiled, a small, knowing smile. "Finish your stew. You look like you need it." Later, as he lay in the guest bed, a comfortable old mattress under a heavy handmade quilt, Adrian stared at the ceiling and listened to the sounds of the house. The creak of the floorboards, the howl of the wind against the windows, the distant, steady rhythm of a grandfather clock in the hall. It was a world away from the sterile, silent penthouses and climate-controlled environments he inhabited. His life was a fortress of solitude, designed to keep the messiness of the world at bay. Yet here he was, in the heart of that messiness, wearing a borrowed shirt and feeling a strange sense of peace he couldn't remember ever experiencing. His thoughts drifted back to the men on the hill. Who were they? Opportunistic thieves, seeing a rich target, or something more sinister? He had enemies, of course. In his line of work, you collected them like expensive watches. But this felt different, random, desperate, a product of the forgotten, crumbling places that dotted the landscape between the gleaming cities where he made his fortune. And then he thought of Lily, the absurd, beautiful image of her, with her little red tractor. It was a gesture of such profound, uncalculated goodness that it had somehow short-circuited the entire, terrifying event. It was as if her innocence had been a shield, deflecting the ugliness of the world. In the darkness of the strange room, surrounded by the storm, Adrian Sterling felt a single, hot tear trace a path down his temple and into his hair. It was the first tear he had shed in 3 years. Not for his lost car, not for his brush with danger, but for a kindness so simple and pure, it had managed to find a crack in the armor he had so carefully built around his heart. He fell asleep, not to the sound of the storm, but to the memory of an off-key nursery rhyme, a lullaby in the midst of chaos. The next morning, the world was washed clean. The storm had broken sometime before dawn, leaving behind a sky of bruised purples and soft emerging blues. The air was crisp and smelled of damp earth and pine. Adrian woke slowly, the unfamiliar weight of the quilt a comforting presence. For a moment, he didn't know where he was. The pale light filtering through the lace curtains, the ticking of the clock, the distant crow of a rooster. It was all alien to him. Then the memory of the previous night rushed back in. The Ferrari, the mud, the rocks, Lily. He got out of bed and went to the window. The view was of rolling hills, still shrouded in mist, and a sprawling patchwork of fields and woods. The farmhouse was perched on a rise, overlooking a valley. It was beautiful, in a rugged, untamed way that made his landscaped urban gardens seem sterile and artificial. Below, in the farmyard, Tom was already at work, tossing hay to a small herd of dairy cows. His movements were efficient and practiced, a man in his element. The farm, Adrian could see now, was not a hobby. It was a working operation, but it was small, and it looked tired. Fences were mended in a dozen different places. A tractor in the barn looked ancient, and the barn roof itself was sagging in the middle. This was not a place of prosperity. It was a place of survival. He dressed in Tom's clothes again, leaving his own ruined suit in a heap. When he came downstairs, the kitchen was already a hive of activity. Sarah was at the stove, flipping pancakes, while Lily sat at the table, meticulously coloring in a picture of a horse. The smell of coffee and frying bacon was intoxicating. "Morning," Sarah said, smiling over her shoulder. "Sleep all right?" "Like a log," Adrian admitted, which was true. He hadn't slept so soundly in years, free from the restless, phantom anxieties that usually plagued his nights. "Coffee's on the counter. Help yourself." He poured a mug of the dark, strong coffee. It was brewed in an old-fashioned percolator, and was leagues better than the single-origin, artisanal nonsense his personal chef usually prepared. He sat at the table, across from Lily. She looked up from her drawing and gave him a serious, appraising look. "You're not a prince, are you?" she asked. Adrian blinked. "I don't think so." "Why? Your car is like a prince's car, but you look like my daddy now." He glanced down at the worn flannel and denim. "I suppose I do." "It's okay," she said magnanimously. "You can be a farmer prince." Sarah placed a heaping plate of pancakes, bacon, and scrambled eggs in front of him. "Don't mind her," she said, ruffling Lily's hair. "She has an imagination that could power a city." They ate in a comfortable silence for a few minutes, punctuated by Lily's chatter. Adrian found himself listening, truly listening, to her stories about the cows' names and the squirrel that lived in the big oak tree. It was a conversation with no agenda, no subtext, no ulterior motive. It was just real. Tom came in, stamping the mud from his boots on the mat by the door. He poured himself a coffee and leaned against the counter, his face weary but content. "Road's still a mess," he announced to Adrian. "Took the truck up to the ridge. The creek's crested its banks all the way down to the highway. Even if you could get your car out of that hole, you wouldn't get far. It'll be a day or two before things are passable." Adrian felt a familiar spike of anxiety. A day or two. In his world, a day was an eternity. Deals could collapse, markets could turn, fortunes could be lost. He had a board meeting in New York in 48 hours. He had a conference call with Tokyo in 6. He was supposed to be unreachable, but not like this. This was being truly, fundamentally disconnected. "Is there a landline I could use?" he asked. "My cell is dead, and I'm sure it wouldn't get a signal out here anyway." "Sure thing," Tom said, gesturing with his mug to an old rotary phone on the wall. "It's a party line, though, so you might have to wait for Mrs. Gable down the road to finish her gossip." Adrian stared at the phone. A party line. He hadn't used one of those since he was a child, visiting his grandparents in a town not unlike this one. The thought sent a strange pang through his chest. He made the call. The first person he tried to reach was his head of security, a man named Gavin. He let the phone ring a dozen times before a tinny, robotic voice informed him that all circuits were busy. The storm had likely knocked out communication lines across the region. He was well and truly cut off. The anxiety began to curdle into a strange sense of liberation. There was nothing he could do. He couldn't check his stocks. He couldn't answer the hundreds of emails that were undoubtedly piling up. He couldn't micromanage his global empire. For the first time in his adult life, Adrian Sterling was powerless. And it was terrifying. And it was peaceful. "No luck?" Tom asked, reading his expression. Adrian shook his head. "Seems I'm officially off the grid." "Well," Tom said, finishing his coffee, "might as well make yourself useful. I've got a fence down in the south pasture that needs mending. Ever stretched wire?" Adrian had to laugh. "The only wires I've ever stretched are in multi-billion-dollar telecommunication deals." Tom grinned. "Same principle, just a lot more mud." And that was how Adrian Sterling, CEO of Sterling Enterprises, a man whose net worth exceeded the GDP of several small nations, found himself spending the day wading through a muddy pasture, digging post holes, and stretching barbed wire under the patient and often amused instruction of a small-scale dairy farmer. The work was brutally physical. His hands, accustomed to the smooth surfaces of touch screens and boardroom tables, were quickly raw and blistered. His back ached. His borrowed boots were heavy with mud. But as the hours wore on, something strange happened. The rhythm of the work, the thud of the post driver, the creak of the wire stretcher, the simple, shared goal of making something broken whole again, was meditative. His mind, usually a chaotic whirlwind of data points, market projections, and strategic threats, began to quiet down. He wasn't thinking about the upcoming board meeting or his corporate rivals. He was thinking about getting the tension on the wire just right. He was thinking about the satisfaction of driving a staple into a new post. He was focused on the immediate, tangible world around him. Tom was a patient teacher. He didn't mock Adrian's ineptitude, though there was a constant twinkle of humor in his eyes. He simply showed him what to do, corrected his mistakes, and shared the comfortable silence of men engaged in a common task. During a break, they sat on a grassy knoll overlooking the valley, sharing a thermos of coffee Sarah had sent with them. "You never said what you do for a living?" Tom said casually. It was the first personal question he had asked. Adrian hesitated. He was used to the reaction his identity provoked, a mixture of awe, envy, and suspicion. He didn't want that here. "I'm in, investments," he said, the euphemism tasting like a lie. Tom nodded, seeming to accept the vague answer. "Must be stressful." "You have no idea." "I think I do," Tom said, his gaze distant. "This farm, it's been in my wife's family for 4 generations. We're holding on by a thread. The milk prices are in the gutter, the cost of feed is through the roof. The bank's been making noises." He sighed, a heavy, weary sound. "Some days, the stress feels like a physical weight, like I'm trying to breathe underwater." Adrian looked at the man beside him. He saw the calloused hands, the worry lines etched around his eyes, the fierce pride that kept his shoulders straight, despite the weight he carried. And for the first time, Adrian felt a sense of connection that went beyond their immediate circumstances. Tom's stress was about feeding his family, about saving his home, about preserving a legacy. Adrian's stress was about adding another zero to a number on a screen. The comparison shamed him. "Why do you do it?" Adrian asked, genuinely curious. "Why not sell? Move to the city? Get a different job?" Tom looked at him, a flicker of surprise in his eyes. He gestured out at the rolling hills, the green pastures, the sprawling oak trees. "Look at this place," he said, his voice soft with reverence. Where else can my daughter run free? Where else can she learn what's real? The soil, the seasons, the cycle of life and death. You can't get that from an iPad. This is our home. It's not just a piece of property. It's who we are. Some things are worth fighting for, even when you're losing. He took a sip of coffee and fell silent, but his words hung in the air between them. Some things are worth fighting for. What had Adrian been fighting for? Market share? A higher stock price? The empty thrill of beating his competitors? He had built an empire, but he had no home. He had a portfolio of properties, but none of them were who he was. He looked out at the valley, at the simple, profound beauty of it, and felt a yearning so deep and so painful it almost took his breath away. As they worked their way back towards the farmhouse in the late afternoon sun, Adrian saw something down in the gully where his car was still stuck. It was a group of men. Not the hooded figures from the night before. These were local-looking guys, gathered around the Ferrari, pointing and talking. A tow truck was trying, and failing, to navigate the muddy, washed-out road. Tom stopped, his expression hardening. "That'll be Earl's Towing. News travels fast in a small town." As they got closer, they could hear the conversation. The men were laughing. "Look at that thing, stuck like a pig in muck. Bet that thing costs more than my whole house. What kind of fool drives a car like that on a road like this?" The words were tinged with a mixture of awe and resentment. The Ferrari was an alien artifact, a symbol of a world so far removed from their own that it could only be mocked. Adrian felt a familiar surge of defensive anger, the instinct to assert his status, to put these men in their place. But then he looked down at his own blistered, dirty hands. He looked at the mud caking his borrowed jeans. He was, at that moment, indistinguishable from them. He was just another man in a muddy field. One of the men, a large bearded man, who seemed to be the tow truck driver, saw them approaching. "Well, look what the cat dragged in," he boomed, a wide mocking grin on his face. "If it isn't the city slicker himself. Having some car trouble?" The other men chuckled. Adrian braced himself, but Tom stepped forward, his presence solid and unmovable. "All right, Earl," Tom said, his voice calm. "That's enough. The man's had a rough night." Earl's grin faltered slightly under Tom's steady gaze. There was a history between these men, a shared language of community and respect that Adrian was not privy to. "Just having a bit of fun, Tom," Earl said defensively. "It ain't every day you see a spaceship crashed in Miller's Creek." "Well, the fun's over," Tom said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Can you get it out?" Earl shook his head, gesturing at the churned-up road. "Not a chance. Not until the county comes and grades this mess. And you know how long that takes. That car's going to be a landmark for a while yet." The men laughed again, but the malice was gone, replaced by a sort of communal resignation to the way things were. Adrian looked at his car, the magnificent, powerful machine, now reduced to a piece of impotent sculpture, an object of ridicule. A year ago, this would have infuriated him. He would have been on the phone, screaming at assistance, threatening lawsuits, leveraging his power to make the world bend to his will. But now, he just felt tired. He looked at the car, a monument to his wealth and isolation, and felt nothing. No pride, no anger, not even a sense of loss. It was just a thing, a very expensive, very beautiful, very useless thing. He turned away from it and looked back towards the farmhouse, where a thin curl of smoke was rising from the chimney. Sarah would be starting dinner. Lily would be finishing her drawing of the horse. And for the first time in a long, long time, Adrian Sterling wanted to be home. The problem was, he no longer knew where that was. That evening, a fragile sense of normalcy began to settle over Adrian. He helped Sarah shell peas for dinner, his large, clumsy hands struggling with the small pods, while she worked with a deftness that was mesmerizing. He listened as Lily read a storybook to him, her small finger tracing the words as she haltingly sounded them out. He was an observer, a foreign correspondent in the land of family, and he found himself captivated by the mundane details of their lives. The way Tom and Sarah communicated with a glance, the easy, unforced affection, the gentle rhythm of their shared existence. It was a stark contrast to his own life, which was a series of scheduled appointments, transactions, and solitary moments in sterile environments. His relationships, even with the women he dated, had been more like mergers than partnerships, always with an eye on the strategic advantage. After Lily was put to bed, the three adults sat in the living room, the only light coming from a crackling fire in the hearth. The power was still out in some parts of the county. For a while, they just sat in silence, watching the flames. It was a comfortable silence, not an awkward one. "I need to be honest with you," Adrian said finally, the words feeling heavy and important in the quiet room. "My name is Adrian Sterling." He watched their faces for a reaction. The name was usually a conversation stopper, a name that carried the weight of headlines and magazine covers. But Tom and Sarah just looked at him, their expressions unchanged. The name meant nothing to them. "Sterling Enterprises," he prompted, feeling a strange mix of relief and, oddly, disappointment. "The tech company?" Sarah frowned slightly. "I think I've heard of it. Don't you make those phones that are too expensive?" He had to smile. "That's one of the things we do, yes." Tom grunted. "Never saw the point. My flip phone does the job just fine." And that was it. The grand revelation of his identity, the unveiling of his power and influence, had landed with all the impact of a raindrop in the ocean. Here, in this room, he wasn't Adrian Sterling, the titan of industry. He was just Adrian, the man with the stuck car. The realization was profoundly freeing. "Those men last night," Adrian said, changing the subject. "The ones on the hill. Are they, a common problem around here?" Tom's face darkened. He stared into the fire, his jaw tight. "They're getting to be. The mill closed down 2 years ago. The mines before that. There's not a lot of work for young men. They get desperate, idle hands and all that. They were going to rob me," Adrian stated, the memory still chilling. "Or worse." "Probably," Tom agreed, his voice grim. "They saw the car, saw an opportunity. It's a sickness. They see what people like you have on the TV, on the internet. They want it, and they don't see a path to earning it honestly." "It's not just that," Sarah added, her voice soft but firm. "It's a loss of hope, a loss of pride. When you take away a man's ability to provide for his family, to feel useful, he can become something he's not." Her eyes flicked towards Tom, and Adrian understood she was talking about more than just the men on the hill. She was talking about the struggle she saw in her own husband every day. The conversation turned to the farm. Adrian, armed with a newfound genuine curiosity, began to ask questions. Not as an investor looking for an angle, but as someone trying to understand. He learned about crop rotation, milk futures, the complexities of veterinary bills, and the crushing weight of loans from a bank that saw their farm not as a legacy, but as a column of numbers on a spreadsheet. "We're facing foreclosure," Tom said bluntly, the word dropping into the quiet room like a stone. "The bank gave us 90 days to catch up on the payments. We're on day 86. Adrian did the math in his head. 4 days. They had 4 days until they lost everything. "We've tried everything," Sarah said, her voice trembling slightly, the first crack in her strong facade. "Tom took a job driving a truck part-time. I've been selling preserves at the farmer's market. It's just, not enough. It's like trying to fill a bathtub with a teaspoon." A silence fell over the room, thick with the weight of their unspoken fears. Adrian's mind, freed from its corporate shackles, began to work in a different way. He wasn't thinking about a bailout. He had learned his lesson the first night. Handing them a check would be an insult to their pride. It would turn their relationship into another one of his transactions. He needed to find a different way, a better way. He thought about the resources at his disposal, not just the money, but the knowledge, the connections, the strategic thinking that had built his empire. For the first time, he considered using those skills for something other than profit. "What if you didn't have to sell your milk to the big distributors?" he asked, thinking aloud. "What if you sold it directly to consumers, as an artisanal product, organic, farm to table? People in the city pay a premium for that." Tom snorted. "You mean like cheese and yogurt? Sarah does some of that, but we don't have the equipment for commercial production. That stuff costs a fortune, and we wouldn't know the first thing about marketing." "I do," Adrian said simply. "I know about marketing. I know about supply chains and distribution. I know people who could help with the equipment, maybe as an investment." He was spitballing, the ideas coming fast and furious. A co-op. You could partner with other small farms in the area. Pool your resources. Create a brand. Miller's Creek Organics or something. You build a story around it. The story of family farms, of sustainable agriculture, of fighting back against the big corporations. Tom and Sarah were staring at him, their expressions a mixture of skepticism and a dawning, fragile hope. "You're talking about starting a whole new business," Tom said slowly. "In 4 days?" "No," Adrian corrected. "I'm talking about a plan, a credible business plan, something we can take to the bank, not to ask for a handout, but to ask for an extension, a new loan, even, an investment in a viable future, not just a stay of execution." It was a long shot. It was crazy. But as he laid out the framework, sketching ideas on a napkin from the coffee table, he felt a surge of excitement he hadn't felt in years. It wasn't the thrill of a hostile takeover. It was the thrill of creation, of building something from the ground up. Something that mattered. For the next 2 days, the farmhouse became a war room. The landline, miraculously, was working again. Adrian was on the phone for hours, calling in favors, pulling strings, talking to lawyers, accountants, and marketing experts he hadn't spoken to in years. He was met with confusion, with resistance. "Adrian, are you all right? You want to finance a cheese farm?" But he was relentless, using his legendary powers of persuasion, not to close a deal, but to open a door. Tom, initially hesitant, was slowly won over by Adrian's energy and expertise. He provided the crucial, on-the-ground knowledge, the practical realities of farming that Adrian's grand vision needed to be anchored in. Sarah, with her quiet wisdom, acted as the bridge between the two men, translating Tom's taciturn farming knowledge into language Adrian could understand, and tempering Adrian's corporate aggression with a dose of common sense. Lily was an unwitting, joyful participant, helping by making crayon drawings of the new Miller's Creek logo, usually involving a cow with wings. In the midst of this whirlwind of activity, Adrian's old life tried to intrude. He finally got a call through to his office. His personal assistant, frantic with worry, unloaded a torrent of problems. A deal in Singapore was falling apart. A competitor, Marcus Thorne, a man Adrian despised for his predatory tactics, was rumored to be planning a boardroom coup in his absence. "The board meeting is tomorrow, Adrian. You have to be here. They're saying you've gone off the deep end." For a moment, the old Adrian resurfaced. The cold, calculating CEO. The instinct to drop everything, to fly back and crush his rival, was overwhelming. He looked at the phone in his hand, the conduit to his world of power and chaos. Then he looked across the table at Tom and Sarah, their heads bent over a spreadsheet he had taught them how to use, their faces illuminated by the glow of an old laptop, a flicker of hope in their eyes. He thought of what Tom had said in the pasture. Some things are worth fighting for, even when you're losing. He made a decision. It was impulsive, reckless, and went against every principle by which he had ever lived. "Postpone the meeting," he told his assistant. "What? Adrian, I can't. Thorne will—" "Tell them I've had a family emergency," Adrian cut in, his voice firm. "And get me everything you can on the financial status of Northgate Regional Bank. I want to know who holds their debt. I want to know where their skeletons are buried. And I want it in the next 2 hours." He hung up, his heart pounding. He had just committed an act of corporate suicide. He had shown weakness. He had abandoned his post. Thorne would eat him alive. But as he looked at the family who had taken him in, he felt not a shred of regret. He was no longer fighting for Sterling Enterprises. He was fighting for Miller's Creek. The next morning, the 90-day deadline, Tom put on his best shirt. Sarah braided Lily's hair. They drove into the nearby town in their old pickup truck, a folder containing Adrian's hastily assembled business plan on the seat between them. Adrian stayed behind. This was their fight. He stood on the porch, watching the truck disappear down the long dirt road. He had done all he could. He had given them the tools, the strategy. But in the end, it was their home, their legacy. It had to be their victory. He felt a small hand slip into his. He looked down to see Lily standing beside him, looking up at him with her impossibly wise eyes. "Are Mommy and Daddy going to be okay?" she asked. Adrian looked out at the valley, at the farm that had become an unlikely sanctuary. "Yes," he said, and he was surprised to find that he believed it. "I think they are." He had spent his life building an empire of things. But in the last few days, he had helped to save a home. And he was beginning to understand the difference. It was the difference between being rich and having something of value. The hours that followed were the longest of Adrian's life. He paced the worn floorboards of the farmhouse, unable to sit still. He tried to read, but the words blurred on the page. He tried to work on his own corporate problems, but his heart wasn't in it. His entire multi-billion-dollar world had shrunk to the size of this small farmhouse and the fate of the family within it. The phone rang once, a jarring, artificial sound in the quiet house. It was his security chief, Gavin. The information he had on Northgate Regional Bank was interesting. It was a small, over-leveraged institution, heavily invested in a few volatile commercial real estate projects. And the primary holder of its debt, through a series of shell corporations and holding companies, was a private equity firm. A firm owned and controlled by his rival, Marcus Thorne. The pieces clicked into place with a cold, sickening clarity. This wasn't just a random foreclosure. The bank wasn't just squeezing a small farm. It was likely a coordinated effort by Thorne's firm to acquire undervalued rural land, perhaps for some large-scale development project. Tom and Sarah's farm wasn't just a home. It was an obstacle. Thorne wasn't just attacking him in the boardroom. He was, unknowingly, attacking him here, in this valley. The fight had just become personal. Adrian's mind, now fully engaged, raced with strategies. This was a battlefield he understood. He could fight Thorne on his own terms. He could buy the bank's debt. He could expose their predatory practices to the press. He could wage a war of financial attrition that would bring Thorne to his knees. He had the weapons. He had the resources. But as he began to formulate a plan, a wave of revulsion washed over him. That was the old way. The scorched earth, winner-take-all approach that had made him a billionaire, but had left him an emotional bankrupt. It would work, but it would also drag Tom and Sarah into the crossfire of a war between titans, turning their home into collateral damage. There had to be another way. Just before noon, the pickup truck came rattling back up the drive. Adrian's heart leaped into his throat. He ran out onto the porch, Lily right behind him. He couldn't read their faces as they got out of the truck. Tom's expression was grim. Sarah's was pale. He felt a sinking feeling in his stomach. They had failed. Tom walked up the steps, his boots heavy as lead. He didn't look at Adrian. He looked past him, at the house, at the fields, as if seeing them for the last time. They wouldn't even look at the plan, he said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. The manager, a kid named Henderson, just shook his head, said the decision was made. The auction's scheduled for Friday. Sarah came and stood beside him, taking his hand. They offered us a settlement, to walk away without any further debt. They want us gone. It was worse than a failure. It was an insult, a pittance offered to sweep away 4 generations of history. Adrian's rage was a cold, hard knot in his chest. He thought of Henderson, the bank manager, a faceless bureaucrat, a pawn in Thorne's game, destroying a family's life with the stroke of a pen. "It's not over," Adrian said, his voice quiet but intense. Tom finally looked at him, his eyes filled with a weary despair. "It is over, Adrian. You don't get it. We're just small people. When men like the ones who own that bank decide they want something, they get it. We don't stand a chance." "You're wrong," Adrian said. He walked past them into the kitchen and picked up the phone. He dialed a number from memory, a number he hadn't called in over a decade. It was the private line of a man named Ben Carter, a legendary, semi-retired investigative journalist. A man who had once tried to do an expose on Sterling Enterprises, and with whom Adrian had fought a brutal, ugly war in the press. A war Adrian had won, but which had left him feeling hollow. "Ben," he said, when the gruff voice answered. "It's Adrian Sterling." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. "Sterling," Carter finally rasped, "to what do I owe the displeasure?" Finally ready to confess your sins? Something like that, Adrian said. I've got a story for you. A real one. David versus Goliath. Predatory lending, corporate greed, the destruction of rural America. It's got everything. And I've got the proof. But I need your help. And I need it now. He spent the next hour on the phone with Carter, feeding him the information he'd gotten from Gavin, explaining the connection between Thorne, the private equity firm, and the local bank. Carter, a lifelong cynic, was skeptical at first, but as Adrian laid out the evidence, he could hear the old reporter's instincts kicking in, the scent of a big story overriding his personal animosity. While Adrian was on the phone, Tom had retreated to the barn, his customary refuge. Adrian found him there, sitting on a hay bale, staring blankly at the wall. The proud, strong man he had met just a few days ago was gone, replaced by a hollowed-out shell. "What was that all about?" Tom asked, not even looking at him. "A new plan," Adrian said. "We're not going to fight them on their terms anymore. We're going to change the battlefield." He explained his conversation with Carter. He explained how they were going to expose the bank's practices, to rally the community, to turn their personal struggle into a public cause. He was talking about a media campaign, about grassroots organizing, about public relations. It was a language Tom didn't understand, and the look on his face was one of profound doubt. "Words," Tom said, spitting the word out like it was poison. "Just more words. That won't stop the auction." "No," Adrian agreed. "It won't. But it might make the people who want to bid at that auction think twice. It might make the bank's other investors very, very nervous. And it might just buy us the time we need." He looked at Tom, at the despair in his eyes, and knew he needed more than just a plan. He needed a symbol. He needed to restore the man's hope. "Come with me," Adrian said. He led Tom out of the barn and down the muddy track towards the gully where the Ferrari still lay, a monument to his folly. Earl's tow truck was gone. The car was alone, listing to one side, its vibrant red muted by a cake of dried mud. "What are we doing here?" Tom asked, his voice weary. "Getting my car out," Adrian said simply. "But Earl said it was impossible." "Earl was trying to use brute force," Adrian said, walking around the car, assessing it with an engineer's eye. "He was trying to pull it. We're not going to pull it. We're going to lift it." He pointed to the ancient-looking tractor in Tom's barn. "That old tractor of yours. What's its horsepower?" Tom, confused, mumbled the answer. "And does it have a power takeoff?" Tom nodded. Adrian's mind was racing, pulling up half-forgotten memories of his college physics classes, of his grandfather's farm. "We need leverage and a stable anchor. We need planks, chains, and a block and tackle. We're going to build a Spanish windlass." Tom stared at him as if he had started speaking a foreign language. But as Adrian started sketching the design in the dirt with a stick, explaining the principles of mechanical advantage, a flicker of understanding, of interest, began to replace the despair in Tom's eyes. This was a language he understood. Not finance, not media, but the practical, physical language of wood, steel, and leverage. For the rest of the afternoon, they worked. They dragged heavy timbers from the back of the barn. They untangled old, rusted chains. They found a heavy-duty block and tackle that Sarah's grandfather had once used to hoist engines. They worked together, their movements slowly finding a rhythm. Adrian, the billionaire CEO, and Tom, the struggling farmer, their hands and clothes covered in the same mud and grease, united in a single, absurdly difficult task. It was back-breaking, frustrating work. The chains slipped. The wood groaned under the strain. But slowly, inch by painful inch, their makeshift crane began to work. The Ferrari, with a great sucking sound, began to lift from the mud's grasp. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the valley, the car was finally free. It sat on the solid ground of the road, a muddy, battered, but miraculously whole machine. Tom stood back, breathing heavily, looking from the car to their contraption and back again. He was covered in sweat and grime, but the hollow look in his eyes was gone. It was replaced by a look of exhausted, triumphant disbelief. He had taken on an impossible task, and he had won. He looked at Adrian, and for the first time, a genuine, unforced smile spread across his face. "A farmer prince," he said, shaking his head in wonder. "Lily was right." Adrian smiled back, a real smile that reached his eyes. "See?" he said, clapping Tom on the shoulder. "Nothing's impossible. Not for us." At that moment, it wasn't about the car. The $1 million machine was just a prop. It was about what they had accomplished together. They had taken a hopeless situation, and through ingenuity and sheer stubbornness, they had overcome it. It was a small victory, but it was a victory. And it was enough to rekindle the fire in Tom's soul. He was a fighter again. As they walked back to the house, Adrian's satellite phone, which he'd had delivered by a discreet courier who'd hiked the last 2 miles, buzzed in his pocket. It was a text from Ben Carter. "Story is live. Front page, check the wire." Adrian's heart hammered in his chest. The second front of the war had just been opened. The battle for Miller's Creek had begun. The story hit the internet like a detonation. Carter had framed it perfectly. Goliath Bank moves to crush family farm. Local community rallies to fight back. He used quotes from Tom, taken from a brief phone call, pictures of the farm that Sarah had emailed him, and details of Northgate Regional's questionable financial dealings, all sourced from Adrian's anonymous tip. He painted a vivid, compelling picture of a hard-working family being victimized by a faceless corporation. The article was shared thousands of times within the first hour. It was picked up by news aggregators, local television stations, and national blogs. The comments section exploded with outrage and support. A GoFundMe page, set up by Carter's paper, was flooded with small donations from all over the country. By morning, Miller's Creek was trending on social media. The effect was immediate and seismic. The bank's phone lines were jammed with angry calls. Protesters, mostly neighbors and farmers from the surrounding area, who saw their own struggles reflected in Tom and Sarah's story, began to gather outside the small bank branch in town, holding hastily made signs. The bank manager, Henderson, the same young man who had dismissed Tom and Sarah so coldly, was caught on camera by a local news crew, stammering and refusing to comment as he scurried into the building. Adrian monitored the situation from the farmhouse, a general directing a battle from a remote command post. He was on the phone constantly, feeding Carter new information, coordinating with a local community organizer he'd found online, and using a proxy service to anonymously post incriminating documents about Thorne's private equity firm on financial forums. Tom and Sarah watched the news reports on their old television with a sense of stunned disbelief. They had become reluctant celebrities, their private struggle now a public symbol of a much larger fight. "I don't understand," Sarah said. her hand over her mouth as she watched footage of her neighbors chanting Tom's name. These are people we've known our whole lives. Some of them we haven't always seen eye to eye. They're not just fighting for us, Sarah, Tom said, his voice thick with emotion. They're fighting for themselves. He finally understood what Adrian had been trying to tell him. It wasn't just about their farms anymore. It was about all the small farms, all the small towns that were being squeezed into oblivion. The pressure on the bank, and by extension, on Marcus Thorne, was immense. Thorne, who cultivated an image as a savvy, untouchable financier, was now linked in the public mind to the image of a crying little girl being forced from her home. Carter had, with an artist's touch, made sure to include a picture of Lily. It was a PR nightmare. Adrian knew his rival. Thorne wasn't sentimental. He wouldn't cave to public pressure unless it affected his bottom line. And that was the next phase of the attack. The information Adrian had leaked about the bank's instability, combined with the negative press, began to spook its investors. Its stock price, which was traded on a minor exchange, began to plummet. The other larger banks that Northgate depended on for liquidity started getting nervous. The foreclosure auction was scheduled for 10 a.m. the next day. It was a race against time. That afternoon, Adrian received a call. It was not a number he recognized. "Sterling, this is Marcus Thorne." Adrian felt a jolt of ice in his veins. He walked out onto the porch, away from the family. "Thorne, I should have known you were crawling around under this particular rock." "Don't play coy with me, Adrian." Thorne's voice was a silken snarl. "This has your stink all over it. The coordinated media attack, the financial leaks. You've been busy." "Just helping some friends," Adrian said calmly. "Friends? You don't have friends, Adrian. You have assets and liabilities. Let me guess. You got lost on your way to your country club, and these peasants took you in? And now you've decided to become their champion? It's pathetic. What do you want, Marcus?" "I want you to call off your dogs. This is a minor real estate acquisition for me. It's not worth the headache you're causing. You're damaging my brand." "And you're trying to destroy a family," Adrian shot back. "For what? A golf course? A gated community for your soulless friends?" There was a pause. Then Thorne laughed, a cold, empty sound. "You really have gone soft. Fine. You want the farm? You can have it. I'll have the bank cancel the foreclosure. In exchange, you kill this story, and you stay out of my way." It was the offer Adrian had been hoping for. A clear victory. All he had to do was say yes. But he hesitated. He thought of all the other farms, the other families caught in the same trap. If he accepted Thorne's deal, he would be saving Tom and Sarah, but he would be abandoning everyone else. He would be validating Thorne's methods, allowing him to cut his losses and move on to his next victim. It would be the old Adrian's move, a clean, efficient transaction that solved the immediate problem while ignoring the underlying disease. "No," Adrian said. Thorne was silent, clearly stunned. "What did you say?" "I said no. This isn't just about one farm anymore, Marcus. This is about you. This is about your entire business model. I'm not just going to stop the story. I'm going to make sure everyone knows exactly who you are and what you do. By the time I'm done, the name Marcus Thorne will be synonymous with vulture capitalist." "You're declaring war on me, Sterling? Over a patch of dirt and a few cows? You're not in your boardroom now. You're isolated. You're vulnerable. And your own company is about to be ripped out from under you. Go ahead and try, Adrian said, a newfound strength in his voice. My company is made of more than just stock prices and balance sheets. Just like this farm is more than just a patch of dirt. He hung up the phone, his hand trembling slightly. He had just crossed the Rubicon. He had turned a small skirmish into an all-out war, and he had done it without a clear end game, motivated by something other than self-interest. It was the most terrifying and the most exhilarating thing he had ever done. He went back inside. Tom, Sarah, and Lily were at the kitchen table, packing a few personal belongings into a cardboard box, a silent, heartbreaking admission of defeat. They assumed the auction was still going forward. Adrian walked over to the table and put his hands on top of the box, stopping Sarah's movement. "Unpack," he said gently. They looked up at him, their faces etched with confusion. "What happened?" Sarah asked. "The bank is going to call," Adrian said, a slow smile spreading across his face. "They're going to tell you there's been a terrible misunderstanding. They are going to offer you a new loan at a very favorable interest rate. They are going to offer to finance the equipment for the co-op, and they are going to make a sizable donation to a new community fund for struggling farmers in this county." Tom stared at him, dumbfounded. "Why? Why would they do that?" "Because they've realized that it's much, much cheaper than the alternative," Adrian said. He didn't need to tell them the details of his war with Thorne. That was his burden to carry. All they needed to know was that they were safe, that they had won. Just then, the old rotary phone on the wall began to ring. They all froze, looking at it as if it were a coiled snake. It rang again. Slowly, Sarah walked over and picked up the receiver. "Hello?" she said, her voice barely a whisper. She listened for a moment, her eyes widening. A single tear rolled down her cheek. She looked at Tom, then at Adrian, a look of pure, radiant disbelief on her face. She nodded, her hand trembling. "Yes," she said into the phone. "Yes, we accept." The fight for Miller's Creek was over, but Adrian Sterling's war was just beginning. The aftermath was a blur of quiet celebration and profound change. The news of the bank's reversal spread through the community like wildfire, turning the protest into a spontaneous party. Tom and Sarah, swept up in the moment, were hailed as heroes. They deflected the praise, always pointing to the community that had stood with them, but Adrian knew the truth. Their courage, in the face of despair, had been the catalyst. The next few days were spent laying the real groundwork for the future. Adrian, true to his word, used his connections and expertise to formalize the co-op. He brought in agricultural consultants, financial planners, and branding experts. They worked out of the farmhouse kitchen, the big wooden table, now covered in business plans and projection charts instead of coloring books and seed catalogs. What was once a desperate, last-ditch idea was becoming a viable, exciting reality. Other local farmers, who had been watching from the sidelines, began to come forward, eager to join the Miller's Creek Organics Co-op. The community fund, seeded by the bank's donation, provided a safety net that gave them the confidence to take the risk. Hope, a commodity that had been in short supply, was suddenly abundant. During this time, Adrian finally dealt with his own life. The Ferrari, now cleaned and miraculously coaxed back to life by a specialist mechanic Adrian had flown in, sat in the barn, a silent testament to the journey he had taken. but he had no desire to get in it. He made a call to his board of directors. He didn't yell, he didn't threaten. He calmly and rationally laid out a new vision for Sterling Enterprises. A vision that focused on sustainable technology, ethical investments, and corporate responsibility. He announced he was selling his majority stake and setting up a charitable foundation with the proceeds. A foundation dedicated to supporting rural innovation and combating predatory financial practices. He was, in effect, giving away his empire. When he was done, there was a stunned silence on the line. He knew what they were thinking. He had lost his mind. But for the first time, he felt completely sane. "You can accept my resignation now," he finished, "or you can watch as I dismantle the company from the inside out and rebuild it into something we can all be proud of. Your choice." He didn't wait for an answer. He knew that the war with Thorne and others like him would be long and brutal. But he would no longer be fighting for market share. He would be fighting for a purpose. His last day on the farm arrived too quickly. His clothes were clean, his car was ready, and the world he had left behind was waiting. He stood on the porch, saying his goodbyes. It was awkward, emotional, and filled with the things that couldn't be said. "How can we ever thank you, Adrian?" Sarah asked, her eyes shining with tears. Adrian looked at Tom, who stood with his arm around his wife, his posture straight and proud again. He looked at the farmhouse, now a symbol of resilience. He looked at the valley, which had become his sanctuary. "You already have," he said, his voice thick. He knelt down to say goodbye to Lily. She was holding her little red toy tractor. She had decorated it with a new, hand-drawn Miller's Creek Organics logo. She held it out to him. "For you," she said, "so you don't get stuck again." Adrian's carefully constructed composure shattered. He took the small plastic toy, his hand dwarfing it. It was the most valuable thing he had ever been given. "I'll keep it with me always," he promised, his voice cracking. He hugged her, a fierce, protective embrace, breathing in the scent of sunshine and childhood. He stood up and shook Tom's hand. "You're a good man, Tom," he said. "Don't ever let anyone make you feel small." Tom just nodded, his own emotions too raw for words. Adrian got into the Ferrari. The pristine leather interior felt alien. The engine's roar too loud, too aggressive. It was a relic from a different life, a life he no longer recognized as his own. As he drove down the long dirt road, he saw them in his rearview mirror. The small family standing on the porch of the little farmhouse that had weathered so many storms. He drove until they were just a speck, but he knew he would never really leave. A part of him would always be there, in that valley, where he had gotten stuck, and in doing so, had finally found his way. He drove not towards his penthouse in the city, but towards a new, uncertain future. He didn't know exactly where he was going, but he knew he wouldn't be traveling alone. On the passenger seat next to him, a small red plastic tractor rattled with every bump in the road, a constant, cheerful reminder that the strongest things in the world are not made of carbon fiber and steel, but of kindness, hope, and the indomitable courage of a little girl who believed she could move mountains. He was no longer a billionaire. He was something far more valuable. He was free.